Thank you for coming. My name is Martin. I'm actually right here in the middle where no one is at. But don't feel free to stay where you are. So I've been working on Geoportal Server for just about 15 years or so in various incarnations. We started off with an ArcGIS metadata server approach. From there, we moved to Lucene, and now we're sort of using Elasticsearch in our technology. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of what it is, and I'll focus mostly on our latest releases and work in progress. So as said, it's been around for quite a while. It's been open sourced in 2010, actually, under Apache license. And we've seen a lot of users take this and implement this and customize it and tweak this and so on. Part of that can be done through configuration. So you can create your own index. If you want to index certain elements in metadata, you can do that. If you want to tweak the user interface, obviously you can do that. But some users also integrate it with other systems, other content management systems, portals, and etc. And so being able to sort of access the code helps with that. The idea of the Geoportal Server has been to provide this search capability, a metadata catalog, in an environment where not everyone uses ArcGIS. Think about spatial data infrastructures at a national scale or international scale, and where different technologies are being used. People create formalized metadata. Maybe some use FGDC standards. The fact that you're here, I assume that you're familiar with all those kinds of things. Inspire standards, ISO standards, or specific organization-specific metadata formats. And so the idea with the Geoportal has been always that we can ingest all of those, we can index all of those, we can figure out the title in a Dublin Core record versus Gemini versus Inspire versus HDSFIE versus ANZLIC if you're from New Zealand, etc. So all these different communities have their own specifications. We translate those and those common elements to indexable fields, and then we index those. We don't translate your metadata. We don't do anything to it other than indexing it. Right? So that's a key thing. And then we provide some tools to actually fill this catalog automatically. Through harvesting technology. So we have a crawler essentially that goes out to other catalogs, to folders, to ArcGIS server instances, and index all the servers in those instances, or read all the XML files from the folder, or interact with the catalog service, etc. All of these things standards based, right? So our focus has been on OGC catalog service specification, CSW. And we have been a reference implementation for that for quite a while now, for both version 2.02 and version 3 of this. And then we provided some additional capabilities like downloading data or a viewer, simple viewer. Once you find something, you may want to interact with it in some way. And so there's a couple examples here. So I mentioned we started off with ArcGIS, and then we became an extension to ArcGIS Server, and so it was the Geoportal Server extension version 9 and version 10. And at that point we said, we really need some different technology. We are going to essentially disconnect from the ArcGIS Server platform, and we essentially restarted numbering from version 1. So that became Geoportal Server 1. 2 years ago now, we decided, working with some customers, that the catalogs that we could build with the Geoportal 1 sort of technology based on Lucene couldn't handle their catalogs. So this was NOAA, who have many millions, tens of millions of what they call granules, individual surveys from ships or buoy datasets or satellite datasets and so on. And with Lucene, which worked great for an indexing technology, but you were kind of limited to a single node, if you will, a single machine that can do the indexing. And after a couple of millions of records in the catalog, the publishing became very slow, the searching just couldn't scale, and so on. And that made us decide to switch to Elasticsearch, and that resulted in this version 2 branch, if you will. But we, at the same time, we continued with version 1. Right? So version 1 is still being released. We made 1.2.9 available not so long ago, a standalone metadata catalog, as it has been for many years. And then in version 2, we started off with also componentizing. So not only switching to a different search engine and a different search experience for the user, but also componentizing the capabilities of Geoportal so that you could actually use it in conjunction with other ArcGIS components. We sort of lived for a while in this one universe of metadata catalogs and Geoportal Server. And what we're trying to do now is to bridge the distinction with Geoportal and with ArcGIS Portal or with ArcGIS Online by providing these extending capabilities to ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Portal, while at the same time still allowing someone to build their own metadata catalog and doing the things that they have been doing with the Geoportal in earlier versions. Right, so extending ArcGIS is really one of the focus areas that we're working on in the Geoportal. And what that means, and I'll go through these one by one, and I'll have some demonstrations of these also, is that we essentially pulled out the catalog part of it. Right, so where in the Geoportal 1 version, it was everything in a single app, web app, and with all these capabilities more or less existed already, but everything existed in a single web app, and these are the individual components that we're going to work on, and we have available to some extent already for this next sort of couple of years of development. So a catalog itself, the metadata catalog, installable and so on. A search component, which really is just a set of APIs, harvesting the ability to read metadata from one place and put it in another place. Metadata editing. If you work with ArcGIS Online or Portal for ArcGIS, you'll notice that a couple releases ago it got a metadata editing capability. That metadata editing capability is developed by our team in Geoportal Server and is part of the JavaScript API, and that opens up a number of possibilities there. We developed some web app builder widgets over time and sort of making those available. And where in the past we've worked with ArcMap and what we called a CSW client, really an add-in to ArcMap to allow you to search different CSW catalogs from other providers. We are sort of now moving that into an ArcGIS Pro configuration. And I'll come back to that in more detail. So this new catalog is basically rebuilt entirely. The older version of the Geoportal used Java server faces as the front end, and we switched to HTML JavaScript because that's what we do nowadays. We use Elasticsearch as the back end, which gives us this scalability and flexibility, and also gives us these facets that you can see on the right-hand side. Those facets have become a little bit of the kind of the new and modern way to build data catalogs, right? So if you think about a couple of years ago, maybe 5-10 years ago, everyone wanted to do what Google does, right? A single box, and it has to be super smart, and you put in whatever you want, and it'll find what you need. Later, you see some developments of doing faceted search, like you would see on a retail website or Amazon or other kind of websites where they essentially have a metadata catalog, right, of the things that you can buy through their website. And if you go to the Home Depot website, for those from the US, you go to the garden section and then go to the power tools and the lawnmowers, and then to the individual parts, and then you will find this little wire that goes into your lawnmower thingy that you never know what is the part number and which one actually fits in your lawnmower. Well, so by starting from the entire store, you kind of filter down to the few, maybe 5 or 6 types of wires or elements that fit your particular lawnmower, right? So think about that approach for metadata search. Rather than searching from nothing and trying some keywords and hopefully you find something, you typed in river, but the metadata actually included the word stream. Oh, now we need to do semantic search, right? So now we need to think about how river and stream are related terms. Right, so we did all of those kinds of things with Geoportal 1, and it helped, but it didn't really make it super easy for users. because they don't know, right? They don't know what they're looking for or what words to use to find the things they're looking for. So we flip that around, faceted search, start with everything, leave out what you don't need, and then, what is that, Occam's razor, right? You end up with the things that are actually useful for you. You can configure the index. I'll show two very different examples of this, the way you want, which means you can have different facets, your XML or even the JSON, right? Because we're using Elasticsearch in the backend. You don't actually need to publish XML. You can just publish some JSON to Elastic, and if it follows sort of a good structure, then you can build your index on it, and you can have this user interface work with your particular JSON structure. On the outside, for those who work in open data sort of contexts, here in the US, agencies, federal agencies and state agencies are providing their catalog holdings to data.gov. That is to be the single master, if you will, of open data in the US from government sources. So you can provide information in DCAT format, which is kind of the way that those kind of open data catalogs ingest complete listings of other catalogs. CSW, as I mentioned, right? So we've been doing catalog services for quite a while, and we continue to do this. In this Geoportal 2, we adopted version 3, the new version of the spec of OGC. For those who are familiar with it, the CSW 202 spec was very XML-centric, pretty sophisticated, if you will, in terms of the query language. There's an OGC filter specification for that. CSW 3 is much more aligned with something like OpenSearch. Simple GET requests with your search query on it, and responses that could be any type of response as long as you advertise what kind of response it supports. Just like we did with the Geoportal 1 sort of branch, if you will, we can do authentication with Portal for ArcGIS, or you can do a simple authentication, set up your own accounts, or connect to an LDAP or something like that. And then we're working on things like metadata collections, which basically means that you can, I wouldn't equate it exactly to the groups that you find in ArcGIS Online, because these are collections that may have thousands of things, right? You don't necessarily do that in a group. But think about how you can separate metadata from multiple sources so that people can only see metadata from one source or from the other, and so on. So the harvesting capability, I'll go through slides first, and then I'll do a couple of demos. The harvesting capability is also extracted into its own application. The idea is that you have many sources and a couple of targets, and you can harvest from many of those sources into those targets. And it's basically a mix and match, right? It doesn't matter where the metadata came from. That doesn't affect where you can put it. This was sort of integrated in Geoportal in a way that you could only harvest into your own Geoportal instance, right? So, and what we see now is that this harvesting, especially in a multi-node sort of SDI, you might be able to, or might want to harvest not only to the Geoportal index, but also to a folder, or also to a portal, or also to ArcGIS Online or such, right? So the idea is that you can choose in multiple sources and targets. Extensible framework, right? So it's all based on adapters and for, if you're familiar with GeoEvent, right? So GeoEvent has this connector mechanism, or if you're familiar with Coop, where you have like these providers and so on. Well, this is a similar idea. If you want to harvest from, say, a source that is not listed here, well, you create a little adapter for that, and now you can harvest from that into ArcGIS Online or into Geoportal and such. Also includes a command line interface, right? So you see a little screenshot of a web app. I'll show the web app, but there is a command line interface, because typically this harvesting is done on a daily basis, or maybe even on an hourly basis, right? Because it's this backend crawler that keeps your catalog up to date with information from this other catalog. And you don't necessarily want to do that manually every time. The standalone metadata editor, as I mentioned before, it's part of the JavaScript API. It is used, that piece is used in ArcGIS Online and Portal for ArcGIS with a configuration that fits those applications, right? In ArcGIS, the metadata is stored in ArcGIS XML. but the editor itself can handle any XML. Right, so so if you want to configure your own editor, you could do that. You provide configuration files, and I'll show you a few examples of that. And then you essentially have a page, or you embed it into another app, and you can do metadata transformations or validations. Right, you can create your own validation rules, and those happen inside when people edit. You can save and load to disk, etc. So that's an interesting sort of standalone editor. And we've seen some organizations use this, even though those organizations also use ArcGIS Online or Portal. Right? So because they say we have a lot of people who are not GIS people, we don't want to give them accounts. They just need a simple web-based editor that allows them to edit XML files. Well, that's a use case for this standalone editor. And then a new component really is this search component. So where in the old Geoportal we sort of had everything again, right, as a monolithic application. We recognize that we have a number of different client applications, and I'll come back to those later, or uses of providing standards-based search interfaces to catalogs. Right, so what we did is we extracted our Geoportal search capability, and we made it such that you can connect it to other sources, just like the harvesting, but now actually searching, right? And those sources could include ArcGIS Online, even your subscription in ArcGIS Online, or Portal for ArcGIS, or other catalog services. And what it then does, it actually provides a new API or a set of additional APIs to you, right? So think back to this notion of extending ArcGIS with some capabilities. With this, you can extend ArcGIS to provide OGC, CSW202, and CSW3 and OpenSearch capabilities. Right? So if you have a need to be standards compliant for this discovery aspect, this search component might be something to consider. And the interesting thing is we wrote this in JavaScript, and then we're essentially repurposing that same code in this web application that I'll show, but also in a web app builder widget that I'll show a little bit later, and in ArcGIS Pro. Right, so all of those three different sort of client environments use the same underlying search engine in one way wrapped with a Java sort of servlet approach, and for web app builder it's just JavaScript, but we wrap it inside the widget framework, and then with some C# for ArcGIS Pro. Right, so that allows us to kind of build on this engine and make it available to these different environments without having to rewrite everything and so on, and keep everything in sync. So this is a new component. You'll see that there's an asterisk with CSW202. We're not going to try to implement the full spec. If you want to go through compliance tests, there's some very specific things that you need to do and need to have in your catalog. If you think about the things that you might store in ArcGIS Online or in other kinds of catalogs, those are so different from what an OGC compliance test requires that you will not pass the test. And so the idea is we provide a basic CSW202 implementation so that CSW clients can search. But there's, for example, there's also a harvest mechanism, and there's a publishing mechanism in CSW202. We're not going to implement those here. So I mentioned widgets and add-ins, if you will. So we have this federated search widget that is built on that core that I just talked about in terms of the searching itself. It can connect to different sources. It can then sort of interact with this, but it, of course, because the Web App Builder widget knows that it's running inside Web App Builder, the Pro widget knows it's running inside Pro. You can then, of course, interact with things. We wrote a few other widgets over time. We typically participate in the OGC testbeds, not in testbed 13 and 14 this year, but because those have very much a European sort of focus. But we work in these testbeds, and we, for example, worked on implementing an OGC context widget. OGC context is a format for exchanging maps and data and layers, etc. It's JSON file, GeoJSON file, and so we implemented a widget that would read one of those context files, ingest the layers into your web app builder map. And then with this second or the third bullet widget here, the publish web map widget, you can then essentially assemble a map in Web App Builder and then publish that to your ArcGIS Online account. Right? So you can create a web map from outside of ArcGIS Online using sources such as the OGC context as a source or a service that you found in a catalog service elsewhere. Right? So which is kind of an interesting sort of addition to the capabilities of creating web maps in ArcGIS Online. All right, okay, so that's enough talk for now. I'll go through essentially the same kind of things, but now from some actual demos. All right, so I'm running Geoportal here with Elasticsearch here, and you see here a very basic installation. I harvested some 8,000 records from USGS, I believe, and they basically just get rendered here. And one of the things you can see is that I can filter by time periods. So these are a few of the facets that you might see in a default installation of Geoportal. And you see that I have a lot of content over here. There's still a few records in sort of the 1980s, which really was the best decade of the century. Right, and I can filter based on that. This is not when the metadata was published, but this is actually the time period as advertised in the metadata, right? So that's a key distinction. If you look at when I published these things, it's basically last year, so I've had this catalog for a while. So what I do typically is I update the client application, the front end that you see here. The back end is Elasticsearch. And that's all there is, right? There is no database involved or other kinds of things, so I can just keep updating my front-end client, my search client, while the index and the metadata in the index all stays the same, right? So that is very quick for me to upgrade my system. So what you see is a few things. You see some links to get an HTML rendering of the metadata itself, right? So that's nice. You can do XML, you can do JSON. We show you what links we found in the metadata, right? So you can get to those. And for some of these, we have an add to map. So this is a new feature. I'm going to skip that because I have a hard time finding actual examples that actually do still exist. A lot of the times what we see is that these references to resources elsewhere, they disappear. Whether it's the program that disappears or a system that doesn't exist anymore, or they change URLs or something. So typically we can view shapefiles that are zipped up, right, in a preview. Let's see. I'll try one. Right. So essentially, what would happen now is it would read the shapefile. Right. So in this case, it would try to read this shapefile. And then it would open up the shapefile, or the zip file, if there actually is a shapefile in it, because it could be a PDF or it could be some other format. Then it will extract the features and render those on the map. If it's a WMS service or if it's an ArcGIS map service or so, then it'll render those on the map as well. Right, so that's a little preview capability. For some of these, you can add things to the map also. Right, so in the application, we have embedded essentially a Web App Builder based map viewer. Right, so that allows me to search some things, and I believe I have the kind of a previous version of the widget configured here. Let's see what we have. Right, so you can see there is some, I think this is a nature conservancy, right? And the idea would be that I can consume this layer in my map, right? So I just click that, and you can see the data here included in my map, right? So this is kind of a embedded map viewer, if you will, fairly basic. Obviously, it's a Web App Builder app that we basically embed in the Geoportal, right? So if you want to, you could build your own Web App Builder app, and you would include a few of the widgets that connect that Web App Builder app to the Geoportal. You then drop it into the Geoportal folders and so on, and then you have maybe a richer viewer inside your Geoportal instance. Right, so in this service, we'll see this a few more times, so that's a service coming from somewhere, and I just consumed it in my map, and now I can do other things with it, right? Whatever you do in the web app builder. Okay, so the idea is that I can configure these different categories, right? So as you see, the topic category is now blank because none of these metadata apparently have topic categories. They're all FGDC documents, and they still have some keywords, so I can filter based on those keywords. This is kind of interesting, right? So this is what we see, for example, with if you realize what you're seeing, right? You see those first, 10 or so keywords. They all have the same count, right? So behind the keyword, you see the number of records that have that particular keyword. Okay, I can select one. I go from 57 basically down to 53 records, right? So that's not really a sort of a distinguishing factor when you're searching, right? If you search, you want to have as much sort of discriminating sort of pieces of information between different things in your catalogs, because that allows you to very quickly zoom in and filter down to a few items that match your particular needs. Well, this is only a catalog of say 8,000 or so items. I have another catalog here that is configured differently. That has 385,000 scenes from, let's see, two data sources. One is Landsat 8, about 150,000, and I indexed an image server with Spot 6 imagery. So I indexed those. I didn't actually use the harvester. I just wrote some Python code that inject attributes from the image server into the XML that is then published to the geoportal. And then I reconfigured the index in this case to understand that it's not getting FGDC metadata or ISO metadata, it's getting this image catalog metadata, if you will. And instead of originator and the resource type and keyword, I use things like azimuth and cloud cover and acquisition date and so on. Right? So things that are different for individual scenes in the image catalog. Right, so the idea here is this is just really an experiment for us to understand, can we do these custom facets, right? So I can do cloud cover or azimuth, right? And these are kind of interesting things to play with, right? So filter down, and it not only filters, of course, but if you then look at the map, you see that this actually represents kind of where is the image taken, right? And then what you see is that we extracted a link. The link will actually take me back to the image service, where I go to the individual scene, and thank you, image server, it gives me the image itself also, right? So fairly basic configuration of the geoportal, really just configuring these facets and configuring and figuring out, okay, what is the data model, right? So what is the structure, the JSON structure that I want to publish, or the XML structure that I want to publish. Configure the indexing to match that particular structure, push your things into the catalog, and then you get a search interface like this for that. And obviously you could do more with once you have the item found, right? So with the JSON or with links, you could sort of integrate other systems with that to do more with the image itself, or maybe view it in a map and so on. Right? So that's sort of a basis for development. So that's sort of two different configurations of the same catalog, right? So it's the same code base, different configuration files, and that's it. Okay, so I'll just move forward. So this is the harvester. The harvester sort of user interface is very, very basic. If someone wants to give it a nice look and feel, it is open source. You're welcome to contribute to our GitHub repository, but it does the thing it needs to do, right? It essentially allows you to configure brokers, an input broker, and you can see I have a couple of these. I test and I try and I build some catalogs, and we have a public instance of the geoportal that we essentially fill using this harvester and so on. And I have a number of output brokers. I'm not going to actually add, but I just want to show you, right? So in terms of input brokers, there's OGC CSW, there's CCAN, popular metadata catalog in the open data space. We help people migrate from their Geoportal 1 to Geoportal 2, so that's the migration tool option. We can harvest from a file, whether it's a folder inside your organization, a UNC path, or whether it's a web accessible folder. Data.gov has some specific things that we sort of added a profile for. And then, of course, other geoportals, right? So the idea is this is actually extensible. You can write your own input broker that harvests from your specific data source, and then you could use the harvester to do that. Obviously, like I did for the image catalog, I could have done that here. I could have written a broker for the image catalogs, but I decided to just write a Python script. Similar to the output side, right? So in this case, we really only have three. Portal for ArcGIS, which includes ArcGIS Online, Geoportal Server 2, those are the examples I just showed, or a folder, right? So, and let me show, then what you do is you define these tasks. And a task is essentially a combination of an input broker and some output brokers, right? So I have a few examples here. Just let me add one here. I'll take our public instance, which is gptogc.esri.com, if you're interested. It's actually the older version of the geoportal, and I'll write to a folder. As you can see on the left, it's really a single source. On the right, I can choose multiple sources or multiple targets. Right? So the idea is you can actually sort of bring it to different systems. All right, I'll submit this, and you can see I have a new item here in the list, and then you can run it. So I can run it from the user interface, I can run it from the command line, I can schedule it through the command line interface, but I'll just show this here. So one of the things we did also in the harvester is implement sort of respecting the robots.txt file. Right? If you're familiar with that, robots.txt file is a little file that people put on their website that direct or suggest web crawlers to either include or exclude certain folders or file types, and how often can you crawl, and do you need some time between different crawls, and those kinds of things. Right? So if you're a web crawler, then you kind of want to be nice and respect those files. Right? Obviously, that also may limit what information you might harvest from a geoportal. If you want to be a bad robot, you can do that too. Right, so I just started that harvest from the geoportal, and let's see if that actually ran. Did I do that correctly? Let me do that. It's not harvesting right now. So anyway, what it will do is essentially fill my folder here with XML files. That's the harvesting to a file folder, right? So I'm not going to wait for that. But the idea is that you can do, and you can do that with the other tasks also, and that's how you can populate your catalog. All right, so I showed you the older version of that widget, right? Remember when I was in the geoportal itself? So this is a generic client that we actually developed as part of one of the OGC testbeds, number 12. Where we included the latest version of this geoportal search widget. And what you see is that it actually starts to load some things. Whereas in the other one, I start essentially with a blank screen. Similar to what we have done in the geoportal app itself, we start to preload items already. In this case, 3.5 million items come from ArcGIS Online. So this widget is being configured to connect to ArcGIS Online, my geoportal that I'm running locally, right, the 8,000 items, the image catalog that I showed you before, and then our old, sort of, if you will, geoportal version on GPT-OGC, which has about 42,000 items. And so what I could do is I could maybe switch over to this one here, right? So I'm switching over to another catalog, so I see the first set of results of the other catalog. If you don't do any search, it'll just list the most recent items. That's kind of a default response. And remember that that service that I added in the other viewer, well, that is this particular service, right? It's the Nature Conservancy public interest items, and I consume those here. Right? So through my geoportal, I can find things, and I can say maybe limit items to this bounding box. And so now instead of the 40,000 or so, I find less items because now I'm limiting here I can filter to only show me live data, which means map services and those kinds of things. Right, so it filters down even further. Right, I lost a few hundred, I think, and I can still inspect the links. Right, so similar to what you saw in the Geoportal app itself, in the widget we allow you to inspect those links and maybe go to the service and see if it's still there. This is what happens, right? They moved, renamed, deleted the layer or something, and that's why this is kind of a key thing if you build data sharing infrastructures, open data sites, etc. Please make sure that your publishers actually realize that their services may now be used by people outside of their organization, right? Make sure that they're continuously available and up and running and performing nicely. All right, so that is the Web Builder widget. I talked about this metadata editor. Right, so this is a single page app, literally one HTML file, that essentially initiates the JavaScript API metadata framework, and then it reads some configuration where I've pre-configured the metadata styles or formats that I want to expose to the user. Right, so and obviously ArcGIS metadata, this is the format that ArcGIS Portal and Desktop and Pro and online, they read and write this format. Right, so if you want to think within that whole chain of publishing and using metadata, you really need to think about creating an editor of ArcGIS metadata. The idea is that is actually what has been done in ArcGIS Online and Portal. And then when you publish your FGDC or your ISO XML, it'll be translated into ArcGIS XML for internal storage. But the editing experience will be reflecting your Inspire profile or your NSLIC profile or your FGDC profile and so on. The metadata styles as you have seen in ArcMap and ArcGIS Pro. Okay, so let me show you another example of this. So I've been working with Bureau of Land Management. They've been using FGDC, and they say we don't necessarily add a lot of elements, but we really want some default values, right? So that is one purpose of this also, is to allow them to quickly populate things, right? So I open up this editor with a new document, and you can see the originator is already set to the Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management, right? So that is kind of a default that they asked me to configure. It's all configuration. And the other thing, for example, they did was add additional keyword themes and thesaurus capabilities, right? So standard in the Geoportal editor is that you can pick one of these ISO categories, right? So pretty standard around the world. But BLM says, no, we have our own vocabularies and people use those, and they actually have guidelines for people to use those. And we also, we work in states, and we want to store those as place keys in the metadata. Okay, we'll pick a few of those. And then if you look at the XML for that, right, maybe just a little better readable. So you see that the XML breaks out these different kinds of keywords in their own keyword section, the theme section, right? So this is a characteristic of FGDC metadata. You have a theme section. Within that you say which is the thesaurus used for that particular section, and all the keywords that come from that thesaurus are included in that specific section, right? So you see the ISO 19115 elements, you see the BLM theme, and you see the BLM states. Right, so that's an idea here of using this editor. And then I can validate this, of course. FGDC is pretty strict, so I need to put in a lot of information, right? So, okay, I'll do now, right? It's a nice, easy way. I need to fill in a title and a whole suite of other things that I'm not going to go through right now. So the other thing we did for BLM was to include the entity attribute section here. So I can include a detailed description, and I can actually describe individual fields. Where did they come from, right? So what is their source, and what is the source of the definition of the field, right? So that it goes pretty deep here actually. So this is a particular configuration. If I open up a different document here, data site is one that I started on recently. This is not your typical FGDC ISO metadata. This is a completely different XML structure And I'll just to show you what you can do here, right? So here's a name and here's a type, and they have multiple titles, right? You can do multiplicity, title 1, and I'll add another one, and you can see, right, I'll get a title 2. My title 1 is over here, and then if I view the XML here, you can see it's not one of your typical XML structures. Right, so this is a configuration. Obviously, this will take a little bit more time than just putting a default value in a particular element, but you can still do these kinds of things. All right, so essentially, what I've shown here is sort of the new Geoportal application, the harvesting, the widget for web app builder, and I have not shown this search component yet. Right, so the search component is not very exciting because it's an API, right? But essentially, so here's an example call, what you see here running to my local search application. The search application is its own web app, right? If you want to run it as a web app. It doesn't require Elasticsearch behind the scenes. There's no data storage or anything else. It really is just that search interface. Right? For those of you who have been around for a while, we used to have the WMS connector and the WFS connector for ArcGIS. Think of it like that, right? It's an add-on to an existing source catalog, and it provides a new API. In this case, the source catalog actually is ArcGIS Online, right? So this is searching every public ArcGIS Online item that might exist there, right? And in this case, it doesn't search for anything specific, right? So let me do a search for, let's see, California, right? That's where we are at, California. Right, so essentially what this does is provide an open search interface to ArcGIS Online. Right, so it's pretty handy to do this. You can see there is an open search description sort of link included. This is what you would go to if you want to discover what are the different capabilities of this open search API. Right, that's how open search works. There's a specification for that. So you can see you can have an Atom XML output, you can have JSON output, you can have KML output actually, or CSV. So let me try this. CSV. Right. Instead of opening up in the browser, I get my output in a file. I could open this up in Excel, but right here it is. Right. So OpenSearch is very flexible in that sense in terms of the output formats that you ask for, that you offer as a provider. So export ArcGIS Online items based on a search down to CSV or KML or such, right? That's pretty neat. So an example here is also a search to ArcGIS Online, only now what you see here, we appended the org ID. And this is an org ID that my team uses in ArcGIS Online. And so, for example, I know I have I did some work in the GSDI, the global spatial data infrastructure organization. And back in 2010, 2013 or so, I created a map of participants, right? So there it is. Right, so now instead of searching in the overall ArcGIS Online environment for GSDI, I'm just searching in a specific subscription. Still searching public content only, right? And so I did this through OpenSearch, but obviously, we could actually do this through CSW also, right? So in this case, it is, let me see if I can do this. Right, so in this case, we're sending a CSW request. Right, so this is for those who are familiar with CSW. Service equals CSW, request equals get records, and then this is CSW 3. So it'll follow some of the open search mechanisms, like the queue and the formatting and so on, right? So this is a little looser than CSW 2. And so in this case, I get my results back searching for the type. So type equals WMS or type WMS. That is an ArcGIS Online thing, right? So you have to understand what does the backend, what query language does the backend actually speak? Because that's essentially what we pass on to the query, to the backend, right? So that's a key thing here. Get it back as JSON using your web app always, and so on. So this is a standard thing you would do when you do CSW 202 or CSW 3. You provide this get capability response. Again, this allows you to advertise what are the things that we actually do in this particular CSW instance. Let's see here. So this is a CSW 202 request, right? Version equals 202. That's a key thing there. And we have essentially provider added capabilities, right? The OGC allows that. You can have additional parameters in the OGC specifications, and in those additional parameters, you can do what you as a provider want to provide to your users. Well, in this case, we want to say, here's the target. And the target is a portal, and it's ArcGIS Online. And so now you get a CSW 202 response from ArcGIS Online. Right? I'm doing all of this over HTTP GET, but obviously with 202, there's a key thing that you can post request as well. And when you post a request, that's when you can do the OGC filters, where you can do a little more sophisticated or a little more structured, at least, searches based on bounding box and this keyword and between these dates and those kinds of queries, right? So that's the OGC filter specification does that. Right, so that is the kind of the API and the component. And so what we then have done, right? You've seen the web app builder widget, and you've seen sort of the geoportal itself because it uses that same component, right? So that's a key thing here. It's a shared component between all these different elements. Here I'm looking at Pro. And in Pro, I have loaded the same widgets. We're not completely done because I'm missing some icons here, but that's Friday, right? Essentially, you see the same kind of interface, right? So I see I can switch to different catalogs. I'm looking at the Geoportal 2 catalog here. I can do a search by bounding box if I wanted to, or only show me map data. I can sort by relevance or date. And then, as you can see, here's the same item again, and I can consume that in my map, right? So this is again the Nature Conservancy public interests, and now I just loaded it into my Pro map. I can switch to a different catalog. You can see it updates here, and let's see if this one is working. No, that doesn't work there. Let's see. Well, let's see if this one will load. Yeah, you can see, right? It fails. So the idea is that you can consume WMS services and ArcGIS services and other kinds of things that, as long as Pro supports those. This component itself is still work in progress, but it is available on GitHub, and obviously test it out, give some feedback. Contribute things if you have other sources or targets that you want to add to any of these. Okay, so you've seen kind of the current state of Geoportal 2, harvesting, search, federated search, if you will, widgets for the web app builder, for Pro, and so that's kind of sort of really the state of affair of Geoportal. The idea is you can use these components to extend your ArcGIS implementation. Now we can do two things. We can either go for questions, right? We have 15 minutes left. I could also give an update generally about metadata in ArcGIS. Anyone interested? Metadata, questions? Question. What about Inspire Metadata Standard? That is already supported in the editor. So Inspire Metadata Standard is already in the Metadata Editor. And you can index it in a geoportal and ingest it that way. Is a question here?
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of times about one of the main challenges is to actually be able to find useful data. So I encountered that problem quite a bit. And packet sniffing and looking at headers, it's often a winding path of redirects and
Yep.
different protocols to be able to actually go out and get to it.
Yeah, and it's so the question is really about how do you deal with the issue that we ran into that services are gone or not responsive or otherwise. Let me show you what we have been doing for quite a while. So the USGS, Geological Survey, they have been working, we have been working with them to provide them a specific feed, specific XML atom structure. They ingest that feed and they have a thing called the FGDC Service Status Checker. And it's essentially an external component that will read our catalog and it'll go on a daily basis, maybe a couple times a day. It'll go try to get a map from the link that it found or get the link, right? And based on that, it builds up a database with a score of availability, compliance, response time, etc. And then what we have done in Geoportal 1 and actually in Geoportal 2 also is show the results of those. Right? So for what you see here, these little phone bar sort of icons essentially represent the availability score that comes out of this service checker. Right? So it's sort of a monitor. Right? It's an external monitor, and if you select one of these icons, you get taken to the FGDC site and it will show you a detailed report of the tests that it had done. Right? So in this case, it's a WMS service. It's valid, right? So compliance. So it does a get capability request. It's going to actually try to do a get map request to generate a map based on that. And then it's going to measure the response time, 0.5 seconds, half a second. And based on that, a combination over time, it's going to come with this reliability score. So this one is pretty good, right? We have seen others that are not so great because they're down in the middle of the week or something, right? So, okay, that's you don't want to build your emergency response system on a service like that. But that is work that has been done in the kind of the existing Geoportal instance. Let's see, but so for example here, I could do the same thing. So by this particular format, that is a specific Arrows data center in Sioux Falls in South Dakota. That's where the service checker runs. And so they ask us for a few different particular elements, like these SDI elements. Right? So this is really the information we give them specifically. The link, the type that we determined it was, and an email address of the owner if available. Right? And of course that email address would come itself from the metadata. The type is what we infer based on the link that we find in the metadata. Right? So that's an integration that would help, at least help users. Right? So if a user understands that, I don't know, right? We don't know about this. Maybe if we go down a few pages, right? So essentially what it does, as it's loading the page, it's going to make a request back to Arrows and say, give us the latest score for this particular element, or this item, right? So that's how we get to these scores. Yep.
So you're using that in Geoportal, but it sounds like you're still finding a lot of red lanes. Have you identified particular trends or problems?
So about trends or problems that we found. So it's a lot of it is changes in machine names, changes in service names, changes in layer IDs, programs that published some open data or a web service and the program ends and then, well, system goes down or the system goes away. Federal government, I saw your hand. The federal government switched from HTTP to HTTPS. I can show you a lot of metadata in federal sites that reference the HTTP links still, right? And sure, there's a lot of redirecting happening, but at some point, that's going to break things. Yeah. Yeah.
So we have redirection engine. It seems like some sort of service product.
Sure. Yeah.
So feeding monitoring results to but actually sort of a web crawl to actually so
Yeah. To summarize, I think you could build. You could use the harvester, right, to crawl those things, and then instead of putting the resulting links and so on in a metadata catalog, it would kind of report back to the source. Your service is not available or something. Yeah. I want to give someone else, if it's okay, because we're running towards the hour. Yeah. Sure. Okay, it's a few slides. So I've been working. Actually, I don't work in core products, right? I'm in a professional services guy, and but through Geoportal, through the projects that I work on, I interact a lot with the metadata team. And over the last few years, there's been a lot of work going on in metadata in ArcGIS. For example, the fact that ArcGIS Online and Portal have metadata, right? Metadata editors. What you see here is a little bit of a roadmap of sort of the ArcGIS desktop environments and pro environments. Metadata styles have been around for quite a while. One of the things that you'll see in sort of in the near future, it's already there a little bit, but it's coming more, is that in Pro, layers can individually have their own metadata, right? So where now in ArcMap and in Pro, you only create metadata for the map. The idea is that you can actually have layer metadata. And another idea there is that the metadata itself could be inherited from the data source. So think about it like this. You have a feature class in your geodatabase. You create and edit metadata for that feature class in the geodatabase. Then you consume that layer in a Pro map. That Pro layer now has metadata. It's the same metadata as from the feature class itself. And you can keep it like that, or you can kind of disconnect it, and now you essentially have a copy of that metadata for the feature class, but now associated with the layer that you can change. And you can we're also kind of looking at making it so that we know what changed, right? So that if you keep the connection and the source, and you update the source, then the layer metadata would reflect those changes in the source, but still maintains the changes that you made at the layer level. And then from there, the idea is that you can then publish that to ArcGIS Online. And then in ArcGIS Online, you would also have a map or an item, right, with a map service. The map service has metadata, and the individual layers will also have metadata, right? So layer metadata is a key thing there. There is sort of on the desktop side, the ArcMap side, for the longest time we've had the metadata toolkit that is making its way into Pro also, right? So for that, the Pro SDK needs to support metadata, reading and writing and translating and all those things. That is coming and is coming gradually. So in Pro 2.1, you can actually read and write through the SDK. And then now they're building on some of the more sort of front-end tools for importing and translating and so on. And then the customizing of the metadata editor is something that you will see later on in the timelines. I mentioned that the web-based editor that we have now, we can actually connect that to Pro if you wanted to. As long as you read and write ArcGIS XML, right, using that editor, you should be okay. But it's not really a supported feature at the moment. But there is some work happening to essentially build a metadata toolkit for Pro, if you will. Right, so in ArcGIS Pro 2.2, right? So we'll see to be released. We'll see import and exporting of metadata, publishing metadata, etc. There will be some spell checking at some point. Spell checking is a feature that's going to come in Pro in general in many different places. So it'll make its way into the metadata editor also. And then the .NET SDK will have things there also. And then, as I mentioned, in Online and Enterprise, Portal of ArcGIS, metadata for map layers, categories, right? So you can organize your items according to categories of things, not just in groups. Marking items as authoritative is already there in ArcGIS Online, deprecating items as well. And then sort of down the line, extensible metadata styles in Pro and Portal, right? So similar to what I've done in the editor, right? Standalone editor, similar to what you can do in the toolkit in ArcMap. that something like this is being sort of discussed and designed for online and pro and portal. And of course, you could think of further things, right? More semantically using the information model of ArcGIS Online, right? So a web map has layers, the layer, or it has a services, and the services has layers. The layers is also a filtered layer, and that filtered layer is used in another web map, and they use the same base map or different base maps. And they're owned by different people in different groups and so on. So there's a lot of sort of a web of information in ArcGIS Online that is all connected to each other that might be sort of exploitable for applications. All right, so with that, we are actually at the hour. Thank you for asking that particular question, so I could use those and give some information on metadata in general. Feel free to contact me at Esri or at Twitter or other places. So come look us up on GitHub. Let me end with that here. There's a few repositories on GitHub. If you start with geoportal-server-catalog, you'll end up at the two branch of the geoportal. If you leave out the catalog side of it, this is the existing geoportal 1 repository. And as you might expect, there is a geoportal-harvester, and that's where you will find the harvesting application. Submit issues, check it out, try it, contribute code, please. All right, okay. Well, that was it for me for this conference. I hope you enjoyed it, and wish you good luck on your travels back home, and maybe see you next time.